What if the deadliest weapon in slavery wasn't a blade or poison, but a slave who simply paid attention? In the blistering summer of 1851, a chilling pattern swept through western Louisiana that would linger in plantation archives for generations. 7 slaveholders across 3 parishes from Caddo to DeSoto perished within 18 months, under conditions that baffled every physician of the era. Each had acquired the same man. Each had expired within weeks of the purchase. And each death was entered into parish records with the identical notation, "Sudden failure of constitution." What the authorities concealed in those records wasn't merely corpses. It was a reality so unsettling that it stayed buried in courthouse cellars until the structures themselves decayed. The man accountable never lifted a hand, never tainted a spring, never left a fingerprint. Yet he dispatched his owners with a precision that transformed him into something the plantation order had never faced. A slave who could not be possessed. Before we delve deeper into the tale of Elijah Marlowe, the only enslaved man to cycle through 7 plantations and leave 7 widows in his wake, I need you to do something for me. Smash that subscribe button right now, because this channel delivers the darkest recesses of American history that textbooks refuse to illuminate. And drop a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from, because this story reverberates through every corner of the South, and I want to know where my audience stands when they grasp what Elijah truly did. The man who would become known in hushed exchanges as the Widowmaker first surfaced in Shreveport, Louisiana during the spring cotton sale of 1850, though his origins remained deliberately muddled in bills of sale that listed 3 different birth states and 4 different ages. Shreveport lay at the crossroads of everything that made Antebellum Louisiana lucrative and anxious. The seat of Caddo Parish, it served as the final major hub before the Texas border, where cotton, timber, and human cargo flowed toward New Orleans markets. By 1850, the town had grown rich on cotton wealth, with brick courthouse buildings replacing timber frames and plantation mansions sprawling like tributes to King Cotton across the red clay hills. The Red River provided water access. The soil clung heavy with clay that retained moisture through merciless summers. And the railroad was coming, though it wouldn't arrive until after the war reshaped everything. The white population of Shreveport numbered around 2,000, with another 3,000 enslaved people laboring the surrounding plantations. The social order functioned with the rigid precision of a cathedral hierarchy. Old Louisiana families who'd fought in the Revolution at the top. Then Virginia and Carolina transplants who'd brought their slaves and their cotton expertise. Then land speculators and overseers. Then poor whites who owned nothing but their skin color. And finally the enslaved who legally owned nothing at all. Into this world stepped Henry Beaumont, a second-generation plantation owner whose father had claimed 600 acres during the Spanish period. Beaumont operated what locals called a moderate establishment. 32 enslaved people working 300 acres of cotton, with timber sales supplementing the income during lean years. He had a reputation as a practical man, neither notably cruel nor notably kind. The sort of owner who calculated profits down to the penny and viewed his labor force with the same emotional investment he gave his mules. Beaumont's wife had died of fever 2 years prior, leaving him with a 19-year-old daughter named Elizabeth and a household that reflected the particular disorder of widowhood. He kept a tight budget, avoided the gambling and drinking that ruined other planners, and attended the Presbyterian church with the regularity of a man who believed God rewarded discipline with prosperity. On April 14, 1850, Beaumont rode into Shreveport with $600 in banknotes, intent on purchasing 2 field hands to replace workers he'd sold the previous autumn to cover debts from a poor harvest. The auction took place in the lot behind the Caddo Parish courthouse, where a temporary platform served as the selling block, and buyers examined merchandise with the practiced eyes of men who'd been evaluating human bodies since childhood. Elijah Marlowe was lot number 7. The auctioneer's description noted him as male Negro, approximately 28 years of age, field-trained, no distinguishing marks or defects, papers showing clean title from New Orleans dealer. What the papers didn't show, because the New Orleans dealer had carefully omitted it, was that Elijah had been sold 4 times in the previous 2 years, each time after his owner had died unexpectedly. Henry Beaumont paid $420 for Elijah, a moderate price that reflected neither premium quality nor suspect goods. The bill of sale was signed, witnessed, and recorded in the parish ledger with the same bureaucratic efficiency that documented every commercial transaction in Shreveport. Elijah walked off the platform and followed his new owner to a wagon already loaded with supplies, showing neither resistance nor visible emotion. The ride to the Beaumont plantation took 3 hours. following roads that turned from packed dirt to rutted trail as they moved deeper into the piney woods. Beaumont spoke little, offering only basic information about work expectations and the layout of the quarters. Elijah responded when addressed, using the verbal patterns expected of him, keeping his eyes appropriately lowered. What Henry Beaumont didn't notice, what perhaps no white man could notice because the social order required them not to see it, was the way Elijah studied everything. The distance between the main house and the quarters, the location of the overseer's cabin, the rhythm of the plantation's daily routine, the relationships between the other enslaved people, the places where authority was enforced and the places where it merely assumed compliance. Elijah was assigned a cabin shared with 2 other field hands, given a blanket and a weekly ration of cornmeal and salt pork, and put to work in the cotton fields the following morning. His behavior over the next 6 weeks gave no one cause for concern. He worked steadily without being exceptional, spoke rarely, caused no disturbances. The overseer, a man named Wallace Reed who'd worked for the Beaumonts since before Henry inherited the land, marked him down in his records as satisfactory but not notable. The other enslaved people, however, noticed something the white men missed. Elijah asked questions, not the dangerous questions that challenged authority, but the careful questions that mapped relationships and routines. He learned who was favored, who was punished, who had tried to run, who had been broken by the system. He learned that Beaumont suffered from headaches that left him bedridden for days, that he took laudanum for the pain, that his daughter mixed his medicine and managed much of the household in his invalid hours. He learned that the Beaumont plantation operated on credit extended by Shreveport merchants, that the previous year's harvest had barely covered debts, that Henry Beaumont was a man walking a financial tightrope who couldn't afford another bad season. On the night of June 2, 1850, Henry Beaumont retired to his bedroom, complaining of one of his recurring headaches. His daughter Elizabeth brought him his usual dose of laudanum, dissolved in water, as she'd done hundreds of times before. He drank it, dismissed her, and settled into his bed to wait for the medicine to take effect. By morning, Henry Beaumont was dead. The discovery came at first light when Elizabeth knocked on her father's door to bring him breakfast and received no answer. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked because who needed to lock doors in their own house, protected by their own property? She found him in his bed, lying on his back with his eyes half open, his body already cooling in the morning air that carried the scent of pine resin through open windows. Elizabeth's scream brought the house servants running, and within minutes, Wallace Reed was dispatching a rider to Shreveport to fetch Dr. Ambrose Langley, the only trained physician within 20 miles. The doctor arrived 3 hours later, riding hard enough to lather his horse, and conducted an examination that would be recorded in his personal journal with unusual detail. Patient discovered in state of rigor mortis approximately 6 to 8 hours post-mortem. Langley wrote, "No evidence of violence to the body, no unusual discoloration of the skin, no odor suggesting poisoning by common substances, pupils fixed and dilated. Expression suggests neither pain nor fear, but rather the peaceful aspect of one who died in sleep." Upon questioning the daughter, learned that deceased had consumed his usual evening dose of laudanum for chronic head pain. Empty medicine glass found on bedside table unwashed. Cause of death appears to be sudden failure of heart or respiration, possibly triggered by apoplexy or some sudden internal rupture given patient's history of chronic head pain. Suspect underlying condition finally proved fatal. It was a perfectly reasonable conclusion for 1850 medicine, which understood little about sudden cardiac events and even less about the subtle ways a human body could be induced to stop functioning. Dr. Langley signed a death certificate listing natural causes, failure of constitution, and departed with his $5 fee, leaving behind a plantation in sudden chaos. The funeral took place 3 days later at the Presbyterian Church, with Henry Beaumont buried in the churchyard alongside his wife. Elizabeth, now orphaned and technically in control of the plantation, but practically helpless under the legal restrictions placed on unmarried women, found herself dependent on her father's executor, a Shreveport attorney named Benjamin Hargrove, who'd handled the Beaumont family's legal affairs for 2 decades. The plantation itself entered the peculiar limbo that followed any sudden death in the slaveholding class. Work continued because it had to continue. Cotton doesn't care about funerals, but the authority structure had decapitated itself. Wallace Reed maintained day-to-day operations, but he lacked the authority to make financial decisions or purchase supplies. Elizabeth could give orders to the household slaves, but the field operations remained beyond her proper sphere. Attorney Hargrove visited twice weekly, reviewing accounts and expenses, gradually coming to the conclusion that every creditor in Shreveport had already reached. The Beaumont plantation was insolvent. 2 months after Henry Beaumont's death, his estate was liquidated at auction. The land went to a consortium of Shreveport merchants settling their debts. The household furniture, the farm equipment, the livestock, all sold, and 32 human beings stood on the courthouse auction block again, including Elijah Marlowe, who'd been on the Beaumont plantation for exactly 11 weeks. The second buyer was named Robert Landry. Landry owned a larger operation than Beaumont, 800 acres with 67 enslaved people, a 2-story house with imported furniture, and ambitions that matched his income. He'd come to Louisiana from Alabama in 1847, bringing his slaves and his agricultural knowledge, and he'd prospered enough to start giving his opinions weight in parish politics. He was 42 years old, married with 3 children, a deacon at the Baptist church, and a man who believed that slavery was not merely profitable, but morally ordained by Scripture. He paid $380 for Elijah, $40 less than Beaumont had paid, because estate sales always went cheaper than market auctions, and transported him to a plantation that operated with military precision. Landry ran what he called a rational system with detailed record-keeping, scheduled punishments for infractions, and a belief that enslaved people would be productive if managed with consistent discipline. He was neither sadist nor reformer, but rather a man who'd read the agricultural journals and believed efficiency could be achieved through proper management. Elijah arrived at the Landry plantation on August 15, 1850, and was assigned to a work gang under an enslaver named Martin Yates, a man who'd been born into slavery himself before being granted freedom in his owner's will, and who now served the system that had once owned him. The bitter irony was lost on no one except possibly Landry, who viewed Yates as a proof that the system worked. After all, hadn't he been rewarded for good service with his freedom? For 6 weeks, Elijah worked Landry's fields, observed Landry's routines, and asked his careful questions. He learned that Landry suffered from recurring digestive complaints that he treated with calomel mercury chloride purchased from the same doctor who'd examined Henry Beaumont's body. He learned that Landry kept detailed ledgers of every expense and every income, ledgers that showed the plantation was profitable but leveraged with substantial debts to New Orleans cotton factors. He learned that Landry had a habit of personally inspecting the quarters every Sunday after church, checking for contraband, stolen goods, or any evidence of resistance to his authority. On the evening of September 28, 1850, Robert Landry complained of stomach pains after dinner. His wife brought him a dose of his usual calomel medicine, prepared exactly as she'd prepared it dozens of times before. He took it, retired to his study to review his plantation ledgers, and was found 4 hours later slumped over his desk, his skin showing the gray pallor that his wife would describe as looking like he'd been drained of blood. Dr. Langley was summoned again, conducting another examination that would appear in his journal with slightly more concern than his previous entry. Patient discovered deceased at desk. Approximate time of death 2 to 3 hours before discovery. Skin shows unusual pallor and slight jaundice of the eyes, suggesting possible liver dysfunction. Known history of digestive complaints and regular use of calomel for treatment. Stomach contents expelled before death. Visible in basin near desk. Death appears consistent with sudden organ failure, possibly related to chronic digestive condition. Mercury poisoning considered but dismissed as patient, had been taking calomel for years without incident. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution aggravated by chronic digestive disorder. The funeral took place at the Baptist church where Landry had been a deacon. The estate went into probate, and 6 weeks later the Landry plantation was liquidated at auction with Elijah Marlowe once again standing on the courthouse block, now carrying the peculiar distinction of being sold from 2 consecutive estates. The whispers started then. Quiet conversations between slaves at different plantations passed along the invisible communication network that connected every enslaved community in the parish. Elijah Marlowe had been on 2 plantations. Both owners had died of natural causes within weeks of his arrival. It might mean nothing. It probably meant nothing, but people were starting to notice. The third buyer was named Daniel Moreau, and with his purchase, the pattern became undeniable. Daniel Moreau operated differently than his predecessors, a South Carolina transplant who'd arrived in Louisiana during the Republic period. Moreau ran what he called a Christian plantation, which meant he held prayer services for his slaves every Sunday, forbade work on the Sabbath, and believed that slavery was a sacred trust that carried obligations of care. He didn't beat his slaves. He had his overseer do it because discipline was necessary, but shouldn't be administered in anger. He didn't separate families unless economic necessity required it. He provided adequate food and clothing, by which he meant the bare minimum to maintain working efficiency. Moreau's piety didn't extend to his business practices. He owned 93 human beings across 1,000 acres, operated a cotton gin that processed crops for smaller plantations, and extended credit to neighboring farmers at interest rates that would make a Natchez street banker proud. He attended church 3 times weekly, quoted scripture in casual conversation, and genuinely believed he was one of God's elect, destined for salvation while performing his earthly duty of managing the inferior races. When Moreau purchased Elijah Marlowe for $350 on November 12, 1850, he'd heard the rumors. 2 previous owners, both dead. But Moreau believed in providence, not superstition. If God had chosen to call those men home, who was he to question divine will? Besides, the price was good. The slave appeared healthy and capable, and Moreau had never been a man to let gossip influence sound business decisions. Elijah arrived at the Moreau plantation and was assigned to the cotton gin operation. Work that required more skill than field labor and brought him into closer proximity to the plantation's commercial operations. He worked alongside 15 other enslaved people who operated the machinery, processed the raw cotton, and loaded bales for transport to the Shreveport shipping depot. Moreau himself spent 3 days each week at the gin supervising operations and meeting with the small farmers who brought their crops for processing. He was a visible presence, a man who believed that personal oversight prevented theft and inefficiency. He also believed in setting an example of proper Christian behavior, which meant he didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't consort with women other than his wife, and maintained what he considered a clean household. What Moreau didn't know, what his piety prevented him from seeing, was that his clean household depended entirely on the enslaved woman who prepared his meals. Her name was Rachel, and she'd worked in the Moreau kitchen for 12 years, ever since being purchased as a teenager from an estate sale in Natchez. She prepared every meal, measured every ingredient, and maintained the food stores with the efficiency of someone who knew that any mistake would bring punishment. Rachel noticed when Elijah started asking questions about the household routines. She noticed when he inquired about Mr. Moreau's habits, his health, his schedule. And she noticed, though she said nothing, when Elijah began volunteering to help in the kitchen garden, learning which herbs were used for cooking and which were kept for medicinal purposes. On January 7, 1851, Daniel Moreau ate his usual breakfast of eggs, ham, grits, and coffee. He attended to business at his office, reviewing accounts and meeting with a small farmer about a crop loan. He ate his usual lunch of cold meat and bread, and at approximately 3 in the afternoon, while discussing a cotton shipment with his overseer, he collapsed. The overseer's description given later to Dr. Langley noted that Moreau had seemed fine one moment, and then suddenly couldn't catch his breath. His face turned red, then purple. He clutched at his chest, gasped something that might have been a prayer, and fell to the ground. By the time they carried him to the house and summoned the doctor, Daniel Moreau was dead, his face still showing the purple discoloration that suggested he'd suffocated, while his heart continued beating. Dr. Langley's journal entry for that day shows the first real concern. 3rd patient in 8 months, all plantation owners, all sudden deaths with no clear cause. Moreau showed signs of acute respiratory failure, possibly cardiac in origin. But the sudden onset and rapid progression suggests something more than natural disease. Patient had no history of heart trouble, no recent illness, no explanation for sudden collapse. Examined food stores and found nothing suspicious. Questioned kitchen staff and received no useful information. Cannot shake feeling that something is wrong here, but cannot identify what. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution. Sudden origin. The funeral took place at Moreau's church, where his fellow deacons eulogized him as a man taken too soon by God's mysterious plan. His widow was left with 3 children under the age of 10 and a plantation she couldn't legally operate. The estate entered probate and Elijah Marlowe was sold again, this time to a buyer who'd specifically sought him out. His name was James Whitlock, and he didn't believe in coincidence. Whitlock was different from the previous buyers. 2 years younger, Louisiana-born, educated at a military academy in Virginia. He'd returned home to build his own plantation through calculated risk and careful management. He owned fewer slaves than Moreau, only 42, but he ran his operation with the precision of a former soldier, keeping detailed records of every aspect of plantation life, including the health, behavior, and productivity of every person he owned. When Whitlock heard that the Moreau estate was liquidating, he made inquiries. When he learned that Elijah Marlowe was being sold from his 3rd consecutive estate, he became interested. When he discovered that all 3 previous owners had died of natural causes within weeks of purchasing Elijah, he became fascinated. On February 3, 1851, James Whitlock paid $275 for Elijah Marlowe, a notably low price that reflected the growing whispers about bad luck, and transported him to a plantation that operated under what Whitlock called strict observation. Elijah was given his own cabin, isolated from the other enslaved people. His food was prepared separately and delivered by Whitlock's personal servant. His work assignments kept him visible and accounted for throughout every daylight hour, and Whitlock himself made a point of speaking with Elijah daily, asking questions, observing responses, looking for any sign of the threat he believed existed. "You've had unfortunate luck with your previous owners," Whitlock said during their first conversation, standing outside Elijah's cabin while armed overseers waited nearby. 3 men dead. Some might call that a pattern. Elijah kept his eyes lowered, his voice carefully neutral. "Don't know nothing about that, master. Just worked where I was told to work, and yet they all died. Beaumont, Landry, Moreau, all within weeks of purchasing you, all of sudden illness that the doctor couldn't explain." Whitlock paused, studying Elijah's face for any reaction. "You know what I think? I think you're either the unluckiest slave in Louisiana or the most dangerous. Just trying to do my work, master. Don't want no trouble." "Good, because I'm watching you, Elijah. Every hour of every day you're being watched. If you sneeze wrong, I'll know about it. If you so much as look at someone sideways, I'll know. And if anything happens to me..." Whitlock leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "If anything happens to me, they won't wait for a trial. They'll hang you from the nearest tree and ask questions later. Do you understand?" "Yes, master." Whitlock straightened, satisfied that he'd made his point. He'd put the slave on notice, established his authority, and created a surveillance system that would catch any suspicious behavior. It was a rational approach to an irrational problem, the sort of military thinking that had served him well at the academy. It didn't save his life. For 11 weeks, Elijah worked under constant observation. He performed his assigned tasks: carpentry work on a new barn, repairs to the slave quarters, general maintenance around the plantation. He ate food prepared separately from the general kitchen. He slept alone in his cabin with an overseer posted outside. He gave Whitlock no reason for complaint and no evidence of wrongdoing. But Whitlock himself began to change. The stress of constant vigilance wore at him. He slept poorly, started at unexpected sounds, found himself checking and rechecking his food before eating. His wife noticed that he'd grown paranoid, jumping at shadows, making wild accusations against servants who'd worked faithfully for years. His overseer noted in his daily reports that Whitlock seemed nervous and agitated, not himself, like a man expecting attack at any moment. On April 19, 1851, James Whitlock dismissed his food taster, a young enslaved boy he'd recruited for that specific purpose. After deciding that the constant surveillance was making him look foolish, he ate dinner with his wife and children, retired to his study to review accounts, and spent 2 hours working on his detailed plantation records. At approximately 10 that evening, Whitlock's wife heard a crash from the study. She found her husband on the floor convulsing. His eyes rolled back in his head, foam at his mouth. He died before she could summon help, his body still twitching with what the doctor would later describe as symptoms consistent with epileptic seizure or possible poisoning. Though patient had no history of seizures and no evidence of poison could be identified. Dr. Langley's journal entry that night marks a turning point. 4th death in less than 1 year, all connected to the same enslaved man. This cannot be coincidence. This cannot be natural disease. Something is happening here that I cannot explain through medicine. Have examined the body, found no evidence of poison or violence. Have questioned all household staff, discovered nothing suspicious, and yet the patient is dead, and Elijah Marlowe remains alive and apparently healthy. I no longer know what I'm looking at. I no longer know if I'm seeing murder or some curse. I don't understand. All I know is that recommending legal action against a slave without evidence would be professional suicide, and yet doing nothing seems equally impossible. Have recorded cause of death as sudden seizure of unknown origin. May God forgive me if I'm wrong. The estate was liquidated. Elijah was sold again. And the whispers that had started as quiet speculation became open talk throughout the slave communities of 3 parishes. Elijah Marlowe could not be owned. Elijah Marlowe killed his masters without touching them. Elijah Marlowe was death itself, walking through the plantation system like divine vengeance disguised as property. The 5th buyer was a man named George Reed, no relation to Wallace Reed, the Beaumont overseer who bought Elijah for $150 despite the warnings, despite the pattern, despite everyone telling him he was buying his own death. Reed was either brave or stupid, or so deep in debt that he didn't care, needing cheap labor regardless of the cost. He lasted 6 weeks before dying of what Dr. Langley recorded as acute respiratory distress, following sudden onset of symptoms consistent with pneumonia, though patient showed no signs of illness prior to collapse. The sixth buyer, Nathan Cross, paid $90 for Elijah and died 3 weeks later from what the doctor called paralysis of unknown origin, beginning in extremities and progressing to vital organs with unusual rapidity. And the seventh buyer, William Thibodeau, the last man who would ever purchase Elijah Marlowe, paid $65 for a slave that everyone in the parish knew carried death with him. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in western Louisiana intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Because William Thibodeau would do something none of the previous owners had managed. He would live long enough to ask Elijah Marlowe directly how he'd done it. William Thibodeau was dying anyway. At 58 years old, the former Mississippi planter had come to Louisiana in 1849 with his wife, 3 adult children, and 17 enslaved people, hoping to rebuild a fortune lost to bad cotton prices and worse investments. He'd purchased a marginal property 40 miles south of Shreveport in DeSoto Parish, where the soil wasn't quite good enough for cotton, and the timber had already been logged out by previous owners. He'd struggled through 2 years of inadequate harvests, watched his children abandon him for better prospects in New Orleans, and seen his wife waste away from consumption until she died in the spring of 1851. By August of that year, when he heard about a slave being sold cheap in Shreveport because of rumors nobody sensible believed, William Thibodeau knew he had maybe 6 months before the creditors foreclosed on his worthless land. He knew his own body was failing, the cough that wouldn't quit, the weight he couldn't keep on, the exhaustion that made every day feel like climbing a mountain. He knew he was going to die on his worthless land alone, having failed at everything that mattered. So when the auctioneer in Shreveport offered him a healthy field hand for $65, less than a quarter the normal price, William Thibodeau bought Elijah Marlowe, took him back to DeSoto Parish, and did something none of the previous owners had considered. He asked questions, not the threatening questions Whitlock had asked, not the suspicious interrogations that assumed guilt. Instead, on their third evening together, sitting on the porch of a house that was falling apart around them, Thibodeau offered Elijah a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute most slaves received, and spoke to him like a human being. "You've killed 6 men," Thibodeau said, his voice matter of fact, carrying no anger or accusation. "I know it. You know it. Every slave in 3 parishes knows it. What I can't figure out is how." Elijah sat silent, the coffee cup in his hands, calculating whether this was another trap. "I'm dying anyway," Thibodeau continued, staring out at fields gone to weed. "Got maybe 6 months before the consumption takes me or the bank does. So I'm not afraid of you. I'm curious." He turned to look at Elijah directly. "How did you do it?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of cicadas and the distant howl of a dog. Then Elijah spoke, his voice shedding the dialect he'd carefully maintained for 18 months. "You really want to know?" "I really do. And if I tell you, you'll have me hanged." Thibodeau laughed, a wet sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, he shook his head. "Boy, I'll be dead before any trial could happen. And even if I wasn't, who's going to believe a dying man's confession? They'd say the consumption had rotted my brain." He took a sip of his coffee. "So tell me, how does a slave kill 6 owners without anyone catching him?" Elijah studied the old man's face, looking for the trap, the trick, the betrayal that his entire life had taught him to expect. He found only exhaustion and genuine curiosity from a man who had nothing left to lose. "You don't poison them," Elijah said quietly. "That's what everyone thinks. But poison leaves traces. Doctor examines the body, finds evidence, you hang. You don't hurt them physically because that leaves marks. You don't steal because they check your cabin. You don't run because that admits guilt." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you do is make them afraid. Afraid of what? Of you? Of death. Of the thing they think you might do." Elijah's voice carried a tone that hadn't been there before, something cold and analytical. "Henry Beaumont had headaches. Everyone knew it. Took laudanum every night. Same dose, same time. I didn't touch his medicine. I just asked questions. Careful questions about his headaches, about his symptoms, about how bad they'd gotten. Asked the house servants. Asked the other field hands. Made sure those questions would get back to him like I was studying him, learning about his weakness. And he started thinking about dying. Started worrying that the next headache might be the one that killed him. started examining every symptom, every pain, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Elijah's eyes stayed fixed on something in the distance. He took his usual laudanum that night, but he also took extra because he was scared, because the headache was worse than usual, because fear makes pain worse. Took enough to stop his heart in his sleep. Thibodeau absorbed this, his expression unreadable. You killed him with his own fear. I made him aware of what was already killing him. The laudanum addiction, the headaches that got worse every month, the dose he kept increasing because the pain kept growing. He would have died anyway, maybe in a year, maybe 2. I just made him die sooner on my schedule. Landry, same principle, different method. He took calomel for his stomach, mercury medicine that was slowly poisoning him. Anyway, everyone takes it. Nobody thinks about what it does over time. I just made him aware of his symptoms. Made him think about organ failure. Made him scared enough to take extra doses when the pain got worse. Elijah's voice remained flat, clinical. Fear causes stress. Stress causes stomach problems. Stomach problems make you take more medicine. Medicine kills you. I just started the wheel spinning. Marlowe was harder. He didn't have an obvious weakness. Didn't take medicine regularly, but he was pious. Believed in God's judgment. Believed in sin and punishment. So I let him see things that made him question his own righteousness. Small things. A conversation he overheard about slaves discussing Judgment Day. A Bible verse left open in his office to passages about false prophets. Questions asked about whether slavery was truly Christian. Asked where he'd hear them, but never directly to him. Elijah paused. Made him doubt himself. Made him question his salvation. Made him start seeing signs of God's displeasure everywhere. The stress triggered his heart, not poison, not violence, just fear eating him alive from inside. Thibodeau sat quietly, processing what he was hearing. The other's Whitlock was easy. He was already paranoid, just had to feed that paranoia. Make him see threats everywhere. Keep him in a constant state of alert until his body broke down from the stress. Reed and Cross were variations on the same theme. Find the weakness. Make them conscious of it. Let their own fear do the work. Elijah finally turned to look at Thibodeau directly. Fear is the most powerful poison there is. It doesn't leave traces. It doesn't need a weapon. It just needs someone who's already sick, already dying, already carrying the thing that will kill them. All you have to do is make them see it. The silence that followed was broken only by Thibodeau's ragged breathing. Finally, the old man nodded slowly. You're not a murderer, he said. You're something worse. You're a mirror. You show men what's already killing them and let them finish the job themselves. I'm a slave who refuses to be owned, Elijah replied. That's all I've ever been. And now you're here on my worthless land waiting for me to die of consumption so you can be sold again. Thibodeau laughed again, that wet, terrible sound. Except I'm not going to die that way. Elijah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. I'm going to free you, Thibodeau said. Tomorrow I'm going to take you to Mansfield, get the papers drawn up, manumit you legally. Let you walk out of here a free man before I die and my creditors seize every asset I own. He stood up, joints cracking, supporting himself on the porch railing. You want to know why? Because what you did, it's the most brilliant revenge I've ever heard. You turned the system against itself. Used their own weapons, their own medicine, their own fears, and you made them kill themselves while looking guilty of nothing. They'll never let me stay free, Elijah said. Free black man in Louisiana with no papers proving how he got that way. They'll sell me back into slavery within a month. Then you go north, get to Mexico, get to a free state, get somewhere they can't touch you. Thibodeau turned to go inside, then paused. You know what the real horror is? It's not that you killed 6 men. It's that you proved slavery can't work. Can't really own a man who's smarter than you. Can't really control someone who understands your weakness better than you do. You're proof that the whole system is built on sand. He went inside, leaving Elijah on the porch with his coffee, and went to bed for the last time. William Thibodeau died 3 days later before he could make the trip to Mansfield to file manumission papers. He died of consumption exactly as expected, his body finally giving up after months of deterioration. His death was not mysterious, not suspicious, not anything but the natural progression of a disease that had been killing him since before he'd ever heard of Elijah Marlowe. But what happened next revealed something that the previous 7 deaths had obscured. The true scope of Elijah's plan and the reason he'd never attempted to escape despite multiple opportunities. When the Thibodeau estate was liquidated, a process that took less than a week given how little value remained, the parish sheriff discovered something unusual in the property records. William Thibodeau had drafted a will 3 days before his death, a document that left everything to his creditors except for one specific item. Elijah Marlowe was to be freed upon Thibodeau's death with papers filed in Mansfield confirming his status as a free man of color. The problem was that Thibodeau had died before signing the document in front of witnesses. Under Louisiana law, an unsigned will carried no legal weight. Elijah remained property subject to seizure and sale like any other asset. The sheriff, a man named Douglas Kimmel, who'd served in that role since 1848, found himself facing a peculiar dilemma. He had an enslaved man who'd been present at 7 consecutive owner deaths, a pattern that everyone acknowledged, but no one could prove meant anything. He had a dead man's unsigned will, suggesting that the deceased had intended to free this particular slave, and he had a growing sense that something was very wrong about the entire situation. Kimmel did what any sensible lawman would do. He locked Elijah in the Shreveport jail while he investigated. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and uncovered nothing criminal, but everything suspicious. Kimmel interviewed Dr. Langley, who admitted his concerns, but acknowledged he had no evidence of wrongdoing. He interviewed the widows of the deceased men who shared their suspicions, but could provide no proof. He interviewed the overseers, the other enslaved people, the merchants who'd done business with the dead men. What emerged was a portrait of improbable coincidence stretched to its breaking point. 7 men, all dead of natural causes, all within weeks of purchasing the same slave. 7 estates liquidated, 7 families disrupted, 7 fortunes scattered, and 1 man, Elijah Marlowe, who remained healthy and apparently innocent of everything except being present when death called. The legal problem was simple. Louisiana law recognized no crime in what Elijah had done because Louisiana law couldn't prove he'd done anything. He'd raised no weapon, administered no poison, committed no violence. The fact that 7 men had died after purchasing him was legally speaking coincidence. Unfortunate, suspicious, but not criminal. The social problem was more complex. The white community of Caddo Parish found itself facing an uncomfortable truth. They had no mechanism to address a threat they couldn't prove existed. If Elijah was guilty, he was guilty of exploiting the very system designed to control him. If he was innocent, then 7 men had died of random chance so improbable that it defied statistical possibility. Either way, no one wanted to buy him. The auction held on September 15, 1851, attracted exactly 3 bidders, all of them land speculators, hoping to resell him farther west, where his reputation hadn't spread. The winning bid was $42, less than the cost of a good mule, from a dealer named Thompson, who planned to transport him to Alexandria, where nobody knew his history. But on the morning Elijah was to be transferred, something unexpected happened that would seal his fate and reveal the final piece of his design. A delegation of enslaved people from 7 different plantations appeared at the Shreveport courthouse asking to speak with Sheriff Kimmel. It was unprecedented. Slaves approaching white authority directly, requesting an audience, acting as if they had rights to petition. The sheriff considered having them whipped for their presumption, but something in their manner suggested this was important enough to hear. What they told him changed everything. The delegation spokesman was a man named Daniel, who'd worked the Landry plantation and had known Elijah during his brief time there. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't implicate himself or others, but making clear that the enslaved community knew things the white community didn't. Elijah Marlowe ain't killing nobody, Daniel said, his eyes properly lowered, his tone respectful. He ain't poisoning. He ain't hurting. He ain't doing nothing you could hang him for, but he's teaching. Teaching what? Kimmel asked. Teaching us how they dying anyway. Teaching us how to see what's already there, what's already killing them. The medicine they take, the food they eat, the stress they carry. Teaching us how to notice, how to ask questions, how to make them see what they already dying from. Daniel's voice remained steady, but there was something underneath it. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. He ain't creating nothing new. He's just showing us what's always been there. Kimmel absorbed this, understanding the implications. He's training other slaves to do what he does. He's teaching us to survive by knowing our owners better than they know themselves. Teaching us to see their weaknesses, understand their fears, recognize what's killing them before they do. Daniel met the sheriff's eyes briefly before lowering his gaze again. We ain't criminals, Sheriff. We just paying attention to the men who own us. Ain't nothing illegal about that. The sheriff sat silent, realizing that the threat wasn't Elijah Marlowe individually. It was what he represented and what he was spreading. The knowledge that enslaved people could study their owners, understand their vulnerabilities, and use that knowledge to survive longer than any individual owner lived. It wasn't murder. It was evolution within bondage. Kimmel made his decision that afternoon. He declared Elijah Marlowe to be a threat to public order based not on criminal evidence, but on the potential for slave rebellion through what he termed psychological manipulation. He ordered Elijah held in jail indefinitely without trial under authority granted to sheriffs for maintaining public safety. It was illegal, unconstitutional, and completely outside Kimmel's legitimate powers. It was also the only solution anyone could devise. Elijah Marlowe spent the next 3 years in the Shreveport jail, held without charge, without trial, without any legal proceeding whatsoever. The parish paid for his upkeep through a special assessment that everyone understood was cheaper than letting him back into circulation. He was neither slave nor free, neither criminal nor innocent, but rather an anomaly that the system couldn't process through normal channels. And then the war came. The Civil War reached Shreveport slowly, more as economic disruption than military threat. The town was too far from the major battlefields to see actual combat, but it felt the war's effects through conscription, inflation, and the gradual collapse of the plantation economy that had sustained it. Cotton prices rose, then crashed. Currency became worthless. The Confederate government requisitioned supplies, slaves, equipment, and in February 1863, with Union victories mounting and the Confederacy desperate for any advantage, someone in Richmond remembered a jail in Shreveport, Louisiana, that held an unusual prisoner. The letter arrived via military courier addressed to Sheriff Kimmel, bearing the seal of the Confederate War Department. It requested, which meant ordered, the transfer of Elijah Marlowe to Richmond for consultation on matters of military intelligence relating to enemy psychological operations. Kimmel understood the real meaning. The Confederacy wanted to know if Elijah's methods could be weaponized. If one man could eliminate 7 slave owners through psychological manipulation, could that technique be taught to Confederate agents operating behind Union lines? Could it be used against Union officers, Northern politicians? Anyone the Confederacy needed eliminated without leaving evidence? The sheriff wrote back refusing the transfer, citing public safety concerns. Richmond replied with a direct order from the Secretary of War. Kimmel wrote again, this time detailing exactly what Elijah had done and why releasing him would be dangerous even to the Confederacy. Richmond's response arrived 3 weeks later. They didn't care about the details. They needed the weapon. On March 15, 1863, Elijah Marlowe was released from the Shreveport jail into Confederate custody. He was transported east under military guard, carried by wagon and rail through a Confederacy already showing signs of collapse. By the time he reached Richmond in early April, Union forces were tightening their grip on the Mississippi River, and the Confederacy's days were clearly numbered. What happened in Richmond was never officially recorded, but pieces can be reconstructed from letters, diaries, and scattered references in Confederate documents. Elijah was interviewed by intelligence officers, questioned about his methods, asked to explain his techniques in detail. He was cooperative, articulate, and apparently truthful, which made his information useless for Confederate purposes, because what Elijah told them was that his methods required intimate knowledge of individual targets, long periods of observation, and circumstances that allowed him to manipulate victims' existing conditions. He couldn't teach Confederate agents to do what he'd done because what he'd done depended on being property, being present in owners' homes, being trusted enough to be invisible. He'd exploited specific vulnerabilities in specific men using information gathered over weeks or months of careful observation. You couldn't turn that into a weapon of war. You couldn't train agents to deploy it against enemy officers. It wasn't an assassination technique. It was survival through patient understanding of the system that enslaved him. The Confederate intelligence officers realized they'd been sent a philosophical problem disguised as a tactical asset. They couldn't use Elijah Marlowe, couldn't replicate his methods, couldn't weaponize what he'd done. All they could do was acknowledge that he'd proven something the Confederacy depended on, denying that enslaved people were capable of understanding and defeating their enslavers. Through intellect alone, they released him in Richmond on April 23, 1863, giving him papers identifying him as free and warning him that if he was caught in Confederate territory again, he'd be sold back into slavery immediately. Elijah walked out of Richmond carrying those papers and nothing else. The city was already showing signs of the siege that would eventually fall upon it, with food shortages and inflation making daily life increasingly desperate. He had no money, no resources, no connections, but he had what he'd always had: intelligence, patience, and the ability to understand people better than they understood themselves. The historical record loses track of Elijah Marlowe after Richmond. There are no further legal documents bearing his name, no bills of sale, no arrest records, no death certificate. He vanished into the chaos of the Civil War's final 2 years. a ghost who'd proven that the peculiar institution could be defeated one owner at a time through nothing more than careful observation and the weaponization of fear. But his legacy survived. After the war, when Reconstruction brought federal troops and Freedmen's Bureau agents to Louisiana, a curious pattern emerged in the parishes around Shreveport. Former slaves, now freedmen, began demonstrating an unusual understanding of their former owners' businesses, debts, and vulnerabilities. They knew which plantations were bankrupted, which former slaveholders were desperate, which white families could be leveraged or negotiated with. They knew because they'd been taught to pay attention, taught to observe, taught to understand that survival meant knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. And though Elijah Marlowe's name never appeared in the teaching, his methods had spread through the slave communities like a virus, passed quietly from plantation to plantation, from person to person, changing how enslaved people understood their relationship with power. The Freedmen's Bureau records from Caddo Parish, preserved in the National Archives, contain dozens of cases where formerly enslaved people successfully negotiated for land, wages, or compensation by demonstrating detailed knowledge of their former owners' financial situations. They knew about hidden debts, about property mortgages, about business partnerships that had soured. They knew because they'd been watching, listening, understanding, not as property, but as intelligent observers trapped in an unjust system. One particularly detailed case from 1866 involved a freedman named Isaac, who'd worked the Landry plantation. When the former overseer tried to cheat him out of promised wages, Isaac produced a complete accounting of the plantation's finances for the previous 5 years, including crop yields, sales prices, and outstanding debts. He'd memorized it all, piece by piece, year by year, waiting for the moment when that knowledge would become useful. The overseer, confronted with information he thought had been safely hidden in ledgers that illiterate slaves couldn't read, was forced to pay. Isaac later told the bureau agent that he'd learned the importance of attention from a man who passed through once, who showed us that knowing was surviving. The white community of Shreveport struggled to adapt to this new reality where their former property possessed intimate knowledge of their vulnerabilities. Some former slaveholders abandoned their land entirely, unable to negotiate with people who understood their desperation too well. Others adapted, recognizing that the freedmen they'd once owned were now partners in an economy that had collapsed and needed rebuilding. But all of them learned that the relationship between enslaved and enslaver had never been as one-sided as they'd believed. The parish records from that period show a dramatic increase in land transfers, contract disputes, and negotiations where freedmen held unexpected leverage. Some of this was simple economics. The collapse of the plantation system left everyone scrambling for survival. But much of it reflected a shift in power dynamics that the former slaveholders found deeply unsettling. The people they'd considered property had always been studying them, understanding them, waiting for the moment when that understanding could be used. In 1868, a traveling journalist from Philadelphia visited Shreveport while documenting Reconstruction in Louisiana. His articles, published in several northern newspapers, noted the peculiar sophistication of the freedmen in Caddo Parish, describing them as more knowledgeable about their former masters' affairs than would be expected from people who were supposedly kept in ignorance. He interviewed several freedmen who spoke carefully about the importance of observation, about learning to read people instead of books, about survival through understanding. None mentioned Elijah Marlowe by name, but the journalist noted that several referred to a teacher who came through during the war years who showed them that seeing was as powerful as reading. The journalist also interviewed former slaveholders recording their complaints about uppity freedmen who knew too much about private business affairs. One former plantation owner who refused to be named told the journalist that we thought we controlled everything because we controlled their bodies. But we never realized they were controlling information we didn't even know they could access. They knew our debts, our fears, our weaknesses. They were always watching, always learning, and we were too blind to see it. Dr. Ambrose Langley lived until 1874, dying of natural causes at age 67. His journal, discovered after his death, contained a final entry dated September 1851 that read, "I have concluded that what happened with Elijah Marlowe was not murder in any legal sense, but rather something more disturbing, a demonstration that the enslaved understand their enslavers better than we understand ourselves. This knowledge cannot be unlearned. This understanding cannot be erased. And I fear that future generations will discover what it means when the observed become more knowledgeable than the observers." But Langley also wrote something else in those final pages. a passage that suggests he'd come to understand the full scope of what Elijah had accomplished. The true horror of the Marlowe case was never about the death of 7 men. It was about the awakening of consciousness among people we'd convinced ourselves lacked the capacity for such sophistication. Every slave who learned to watch, to listen, to understand their owner's vulnerabilities, they all became potential threats to a system that depended entirely on assumed superiority. Elijah Marlowe didn't just kill his owners. He killed the illusion that slavery was sustainable in the presence of intelligent resistance. And that knowledge, once spread, can never be contained again. The 7 widows, those who survived the war and Reconstruction, lived to see slavery ended and their fortunes scattered. Some remarried, some moved away, some lived out their lives in reduced circumstances. None ever publicly acknowledged that their husbands might have been eliminated rather than simply unlucky. To do so would be to admit that the system they'd depended on was vulnerable in ways they'd never imagined. Elizabeth Beaumont, Henry Beaumont's daughter, married a Union officer during Reconstruction and moved to Ohio, where she lived until 1889. In a letter to her cousin written in 1873, discovered in a family archive in Cincinnati, she wrote, "I sometimes think about the slave father purchased that spring, the one who was there when father died. I've read enough now, learned enough about medicine and psychology to understand what might have happened. Father's laudanum addiction was killing him slowly. Perhaps that man simply made him aware of it. Perhaps he did nothing at all except exist as a reminder of mortality. I'll never know. But I think about it often, about how we convinced ourselves we were superior while being so terribly vulnerably human." Sheriff Douglas. Kimmel served until 1867, when he was removed from office during Reconstruction. He died in 1882, having spent his final years insisting that holding Elijah Marlowe without trial had been justified, necessary, and the only way to prevent what he called psychological rebellion. History has not been kind to his reasoning, but in his private papers donated to the Caddo Parish Historical Society in 1923 by his grandson, there's a letter written in 1870 that reveals his deeper understanding of what he'd witnessed. "I held that man in jail for 3 years without charge because I couldn't prove he'd committed a crime. But I knew he'd destroyed the fundamental assumption our society rested upon, that we were smarter, more capable, more deserving of power than the people we enslaved. He proved that wrong simply by existing and surviving, and the knowledge of his survival, the story of what he'd done, spread like wildfire through every slave quarter in the parish. I couldn't stop that. No one could. The moment word got out that a slave had beaten the system 7 times, the system itself became vulnerable. The courthouse in Shreveport still stands, renovated and repurposed. The auction block long since removed. The ledgers that recorded Elijah's sales have been preserved, showing the declining prices and the growing desperation of men who bought him despite knowing his history. They're artifacts of a system that believed human beings could be property, that intelligence could be owned, that some people were naturally suited for bondage. Elijah Marlowe proved every one of those assumptions wrong, not through violence or escape, but through understanding. He showed that the most dangerous weapon an enslaved person could possess was knowledge. Knowledge of medicine, of psychology, of the fears that haunted the men who claimed to own them. Whether he survived the war and found freedom in the North, whether he died in Richmond during the final siege, whether he lived out his days somewhere the records never reached, none of that matters as much as what he demonstrated. He proved that slavery created its own vulnerabilities, that every act of ownership created an opportunity for the owned to understand the owner, and that fear was a poison that required no bottle and left no trace. 7 men bought Elijah Marlowe and 7 men died. Not because he killed them, but because he made them see what was already killing them and let their own fear finish the work. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying weapon isn't always the one you can see. Sometimes it's the knowledge held by those you've convinced yourself don't have the capacity to use it against you. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could Elijah have survived beyond the historical record, teaching others his methods in the chaotic years of Reconstruction? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video. For more untold nightmares buried in America's past, subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy, where the truth is always darker than the textbooks.